Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell. I'm your host. And today I'm really pleased to welcome noted author Sid Marty. Sid, it's great to have you here. I know you live on the eastern side of the Rockies, so we're expanding our outlook a little bit beyond Kootenay authors. But I've always wanted to take the opportunity to interview you because I know you relate to the Kootenays, and many of your books are based in the mountains. So I just thought it would be really nice to have you as a guest. And the occasion that prompted me to invite you over is a new book. So just tell me about the new book coming up.
Oh, okay. I should say that some of my prose books are set in BC as well, or parts of the books are. Yeah, well, the book's called Old Man's River, New and Collected Poems, and it covers a lot of ground, basically from my student days in Montreal all the way to the present. It includes complete books that I've written before, like Headwaters and Nobody Danced with Miss Rodeo, and as well as previously unpublished work and newer work.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading through it. I haven't had the opportunity, but I've skimmed it, and it looks fascinating in that you've got a wide variety of poems in the book.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, you start out young and romantic, and wind up older and grizzled. So things change over time. But I like to think that that lyrical component is still there, even with the increase in years.
Right. I want to ask you, Sid, you've had a varied career. You were at one point in time involved with the national parks, and you've written a number of books based in the national parks. Just tell us a little bit about your career.
Well, my first book was a book of poems called Headwaters, published by Jack McClellan and Stewart. And Jack, although he published many poets, including Leonard Cohen and Margaret Atwood, he had a sort of tendency to not read poetry. He just felt it was his obligation as a literary publisher to publish it. But he did happen to read Headwaters, and I was down in Toronto. In those days, you actually traveled across the country promoting your books, and Jack invited me up to the Plaza Hotel and produced a contract out of his pocket and said, I want you to write a prose account of your life in the Park Warden Service, because he says you've touched on it in the book of poems, and I want you to. I said, well, I don't know if I can write prose. He said, well, we're about to find out, because and of course I was flattered, and I signed the contract, which I shouldn't have done because there wasn't enough money in it to keep me going. But anyway, several years later, I produced Men for the Mountains, an account of life in the Warden Service, present and past. And time went along, and I came up with a history of the national parks called A Grand and Fabulous Notion, which Parks Canada commissioned. And then I wrote Switchbacks, which was about mountain people, especially the Swiss guides who hung out at Golden, BC, and Lake Louise in Alberta. And then the later book was The Black Grizzly of Whiskey Creek, which was about some bear maulings which happened many years ago in Banff National Park when I was involved in.
Right. So those are your prose. What about your poetry?
Well, the first book was Headwaters. The second book was called Nobody Danced with Miss Rodeo, which a friend of mine waggishly calls Nobody Danced with Sid Marty by Miss Rodeo. And the next one after that was called Sky Humor, and then there was another one called The Rider with Good Hands. Okay. And those books are, for the most part, included in this one.
Right. So tell me the difference between your approach to prose and to poetry.
Well, I'm often accused by reviewers by waxing poetic in my prose, so there's a difference. Well, poetry is the art of compression, as you know. You're compressing emotion and thought in a shorter period of time from the reader's point of view than you are with prose, which allows you to expand on your thoughts, allows you to provide more expository detail. So the reader knows what you're talking about, especially when you're talking about highly technical things, for example, like mountain rescue, helicopter sling rescue, and things like that in the prose books. So you don't get by with just covering that with poetry, although I contradict myself because there's a poem in here about search and rescue also.
Okay.
But it's really about the fact that I was scared out of my wits part of the time when I was involved in that stuff.
Right.
So that's really what that's about.
Well, I know you told me once that really poetry is an opportunity to express emotion, and is that something that sort of motivates you to follow that form?
Well, it definitely seems to be an inspiring point for a lot of poetry. It starts with a kind of mood, an emotional mood of some kind, and that is what you have to be true to when you work on the poem. And I was saying earlier to you that sometimes you just make a few notes at the time that this event is transpiring that's having this emotional reaction in your head. And then later, because you probably don't have time at that point to write anyway, later on when you sit down, you can then work on that and try and expand it into a poem. That's what Wordsworth meant when he said that poetry was emotion recollected in tranquility. I think that's what he was getting at.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Now, when you sit down, I just want to explore a little bit about your actual process of writing. Do you sit down and write everything at once, or is it a gradual process? Tell us a little bit about your writing space as well.
Oh, I've got a little shack that I built many years ago when the boys were young and rambunctious, and I had to escape them for a while so I could work. And I still use that. That's my main place where I go to work. And when you're writing prose, sometimes you'll be at your desk for hours and hours at a time, as you know, being a writer. Poetry, not quite so much, although my poems tend to be heavily revised. Some of them I've been revised 100 times. It's not an exaggeration, so put a lot of work into them.
Right. So are you a binge writer? Do you write all at once, or is it a continuing process?
Well, yeah, both of the above, I guess. If you get going on a prose chapter and it's going well, you're afraid to stop, so you just keep going. But other times, I can hardly wait to get away from the desk and get outside and do something else.
Right.
Yeah.
So you live on the eastern slope of the Rockies. Obviously, the Rockies, the mountains, have a deep connection for you. How does it influence your writing?
Well, it's hard to say. I think it really began for me at Lake O'Hara in Yoho National Park. I went to work there when I was very young, and I wrote about the influence the mountains had on me as a young man. They seemed to me like presences, especially at Lake O'Hara, where all the peaks like Mount Hungabi, Mount Yuckness, Mount Victoria, and Mount Biddle, they all seem to lean together over the lake, and you really feel that presence. But I didn't think of it as overpowering or threatening. I thought of it as communal somehow. Well, then I went to work for the Warden Service, and in that job, in particular in Jasper National Park, I'd be out sometimes on 18-day patrols, quite often alone because we were short-handed. Well, I'd be alone except for saddle horses and pack horses.
Right.
And so there I lived directly in touch with the mountain earth all the time.
Right.
And this had a profound influence on my outlook and on my writing and on my interest in conservation.
Right. And that's been a lifelong passion, and that concentration, that interest in preserving nature and making sure that what we have today is something that'll be there for generations.
Yes, definitely is the case for me. I was privileged to work in national parks where once you stepped into the woods, it was like stepping back into the 19th century. I mean, you just left the modern world behind, and that really gave me an opportunity to look at what things could be like in the mountains if we weren't so busy strip mining and clear-cut logging and going crazy with quads all over the place. It would be a totally different landscape than it is today.
Just talk a little bit about your new book. Like you said, it's a compilation as well as new poems in the book. It's called Old Man's River. Just talk to me a little bit about the significance of the title.
Well, I live in the Old Man River watershed, and it's called the Old Man River mainly, but you'll sometimes hear Old Man's River in parlance, or historically you'll hear it referred to as Old Man's River. It's named after Napi, the trickster creator figure of the Blackfoot people, the Nitsi Tapi, and I've read quite a bit about Napi's exploits in the lore of that nation, and always had a fondness for that character. I don't really write about Napi in the book because nowadays that's frowned upon. White people don't write about Indian mythology anymore, at least not without permission.
Right. So give us a little bit of a preview. Maybe take a moment and read us a poem or two, if you wouldn't mind, Sid.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I said that this goes back a long time, so let's begin with something very early on when I was a student in Montreal. And arrived from Calgary in a very metropolitan city, and not really prepared for that, in a sense. Mr. Jones goes to college. Halls full of cosmopolitans, and I'm small town, blue collar, spending my nights in a low-rent cellar. 5,000 Jewish mothers are watching these walls. They seldom take vacations. Yet some of you think nobody cares if some curly lad gets pushed down the stairs as a proxy sacrifice for distant Middle Eastern preoccupations. Some doors are verboten where Mr. Jones don't go, except at night I never thought about or felt so white before. Look, who's paying for these bricks? Find me a rational stick of lumber in these left-wing wings. I do declare I'm only trying to fit in. I'll have to grow a beard to hide this Anglo-Saxon chin. So I felt very much out of place for a while in Montreal, but that didn't last long.
How old were you when you wrote that?
20.
Okay.
And pretty soon I found myself hanging out in the bistro on Mountain Street with the FLQ and the Quebec co-eds.
Okay. Do you want to share another one for us?
Sure, let's go forward in time and talk about one of the people I really valued highly at that time, and that's Irving Layton. The poet Irving Layton taught me a course in modern poetry. So I wrote this poem many years later after he passed away.
Okay.
And it's called For the Old Maestro. I have come to be like you, a quiet madman, never far from tears. My titans vanquished or subdued, my guides and teachers gone. No glib rejoinder for Villon's Où sont les neiges d'antan. We grow smaller with each life that's shed, even as our children turn to us, expecting a giant's offering, like yours, in that little classroom at Sir George. The women, young and not so young, sat forward and they clung to every word. We young men stayed back and tossed out arrogant questions that annoyed your disciples. But though you brushed off our parries and our snide asides, you seldom used the power of your wit to whip the young Turks into line, until I muttered, "Sex isn't everything." The women turned and stared me down, but you laughed out loud, and after class you clapped me on the back as if my friendship was your due, and said, "Read Lawrence first, young man, then we'll talk again." I never tried to write like you, but praised the luck that brought me to your door, to hear what I'd never heard before, that poets were the true priests, the unacknowledged legislators still, what you believed and taught, whether it was true or not. You made us proud to write what others tried to beat out of our hides in the little redneck towns called home. You made us proud to be ourselves in 1965, when first we heard poems were not dead butterflies pressed in books. Your voice lifted them into flight. Poetry was this lion-headed Jew, this joyful rowdy man, opening the door to singing school in cosmopolitan Montreal. I stepped through, and did I leap or did I fall into the wide and welcoming arms of the Word?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing that, Sid.
Well, I owe a great debt of gratitude to Sir George Williams University, because it was at that time Irving Layton was there. Leonard Cohen walked up and down my street munching on an apple.
Mm-hmm.
Poets came from all over Canada and the USA to read their poems at the university. Mm-hmm. And so it was a wonderful place for a young guy to be.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, interesting. So let's just talk about that connection. You've had a sort of a lifelong love of letters and things literary. What inspired that?
I think probably one of the librarians at the Medicine Hat Public Library when I was a little boy. I went in there with my mother. My mother was into reading romance novels, mm-hmm. and the librarian kept shoveling books at me she thought I'd be interested in. And as a result of that, I developed a great fondness for reading, which is the most important thing you can do if you want to be a writer. Mm-hmm. The more you read, the better.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted you've been involved in writing your whole life, publishing and so forth. How has the book industry, the publishing industry, changed over the years, and what do you see it as today?
Well, I hinted a little bit at it when I said, when my first book came out, it was a book of poetry. Jack McClelland sent me on a tour from Victoria to Toronto to promote the book. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't happen anymore. Mm-hmm. That's maybe for Margaret Atwood, it happens, but not for the rest. Not for the rest of us. Not anymore. Mm-hmm. Charles Bukowski put it this way. He said, Fitzgerald, Dos Passos, Hemingway, they had it good, the old guys. There were so few of them. Now there are so many. So many.
Yeah, I guess you just have to visit your local bookstore to see that.
Yeah, so that's one of the issues too. There's so many people vying for attention,
Right.
Yeah.
So how have you adapted to the new digital order reality that we live in? Congratulations on a printed book. I love a printed book. What kind of reaction do you get when you talk to readers?
About this book or about...
Well, just about printed books and in general.
Well, the readers I talk to really like printed books so far. Mm-hmm. I haven't heard anybody really espouse digital books very much. Mm-hmm. They seem to prefer to buy the print edition.
Right.
I don't have any e-books. This one might come out as an e-book. I'm not sure what the contract says. Mm-hmm. But the other books are not out as e-books because I don't think that authors are treated fairly in that racket, so I don't subscribe to it.
Right. So you worked with a publishing company, Old Man's River, to publish this book. Who was that and how did that go?
It's a New West Press out of Edmonton. Mm-hmm. And I approached them some time ago with this idea, and I was very happy when they decided to do it. And they've decided to do a series of poetry books with people like me who've been around for a while, and do some collected poems.
Right.
So that's a wonderful thing,
Right.
and I'm glad they're doing that.
So you've got lots of experience in the writing, publishing industry. Any tips that you would pass on to an aspiring writer?
Well, just to stick with it, it's not an easy way to make a living. I actually resigned my position in 1978 with Parks Canada as a park warden, and I've been writing full-time ever since, and also playing music part-time, doing musical performances here and there. Putting together a living as a writer involves constantly kind of not promoting so much as trying to stay in touch with editors, bouncing story ideas off of editors at various magazines, looking for opportunities like maybe writing radio scripts or television scripts, whatever you can do to keep afloat, because it's not easy.
But you know what, I get the impression that it's your passion, because I think you used the expression earlier on that, you know, when you go out to work, you consider your writing as your gainful employment.
Well, it is. It has been since 1978, yeah. But I'm just saying it hasn't been easy. And I kind of take Bukowski's credo to heart when he says, you don't choose writing, writing chooses you. And I feel very much that that's the case. It's something that I need to do. I'm not very happy if I'm not doing it. And I'm disappointed actually in the output I have had. I've only created about 10 books so far, so I'm pretty slow out, pretty sparse output.
Well, that's pretty impressive, I would think. If you were to pick one one of your books that people would sort of introduce themselves to Sid Marty, which one would you recommend?
If it would be prose, I would say Men for the Mountains, and in poetry, I would say Headwaters, the first book. Be a good way to get started. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you, Sid. We appreciate you being a guest on Talking Kootenay Books.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to drive over the Rockies and come over to the west side and visit us. Wishing you the best on your new book.
Thank you very much.
This is Talking Kootenay Books, and my name is Keith Powell.